I hope you enjoyed that grocery haul and seeing some of the things that I would cook and how I made that piece of beef kind of stretch to a whole week's worth of main meals. And like I said, I think in the grocery haul, our main meal is lunch, so that's our biggest meal of the day. I am beat. I might look a little tired because last night we went to a yoga class that was an hour and a half long. Holy crap, like all that downward dog that we were doing, I'm feeling it. I'm feeling it in the upper body, definitely, but it feels great. But anyway, that explains why I might look a little tired, but I just wanted to make a video, well, a grocery haul, because I love grocery hauls and cooking and stuff, but I've been thinking a lot about food lately. Yeah, I've been thinking about food and thinking about my memories surrounding food and just really the importance of cooking. And I guess what sparked this was a series of documentaries that are on Netflix by Michael Pollan. Michael Pollan, I believe he became pretty well known. He's an author. He wrote the book The Omnivore's Dilemma, which I have on my wish list on Audible. But he also wrote a book in defense of food, and I think another book called Cooked. And they turned those two books into a couple of documentaries. In Defense of Food has been out for a while. I can't remember what year it's from, but he narrates the documentary and it goes through just in defense of food, and it kind of talks about the food industry and the health problems that are caused by the standard American diet, which means all the processed foods that we eat post World War II and why that happened and the history of highly processed foods. And it's kind of cool because throughout the documentary he presents a series of rules for himself, which I'm assuming are different chapters throughout the book. I haven't read the book, I just saw the documentary. But a few of the rules are like, if your great-grandmother wouldn't recognize it as food, don't eat it, kind of thing. Like promoting the idea that we need to eat less highly processed, manufactured food and eat more traditional foods, the way that we ate before all this manufacturing business started. So I highly recommend that documentary. It's really great, but basically it's just kind of common sense. Eat as local and organic as you can afford. Eat more vegetables and fresh fruit. Eat less processed, and if you eat meat, eat less of it. And if you do eat meat, don't buy factory farm meat. Buy from local farms if you can, or at least organic and grass-fed and cage-free, all that kind of stuff. And he goes into the actual science behind why grass-fed beef, for example, it's not only more ethical for the animal, it's also healthier for you to eat versus the factory farm corn-fed beef, right? So it's just really great. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. I'll include a link to it below. It's on Netflix. And also, he did a series of documentaries called Cooked. And Cooked is really interesting because each episode of the series, there's 4 episodes, is based on the 4 traditional elements. So fire, I think the first episode is fire, and then water, and then air, and then earth. I think that's the order of the episodes. And he goes more into depth about, for example, the episode on fire is all about the history of cooking. Like, why do we use fire? Why do we cook our food when other animals don't or don't have to? And how that impacted human evolution, and even the chemical changes that happen when you heat meat, for example, or when you heat up and use fire to cook different vegetables and stuff, like what are the chemical processes that happen when heat is applied to the food that we eat. And so each episode is kind of like that. So if you're kind of a food nerd like I am, I highly recommend that. I'll include the link to that below. And lastly, something that's been on my mind for a while is this book. This is The Walls Protocol, a radical new way to treat all chronic autoimmune conditions using paleo principles by Terry Walls, MD. I believe Terry Walls kind of became an internet phenomenon a few years ago when one of her TED Talks blew up. Terry Walls is a physician. She is a medically trained doctor, but she's also someone who has multiple sclerosis. And she claims, and this whole book is her kind of defending that claim, that she drastically improved her multiple sclerosis through her diet, and she used the paleo diet as a model. Now the Walls Protocol isn't necessarily the same as a paleo diet, and there's all sorts of different paleo diets, and I'm not an expert on this, and I don't consider myself a paleo diet person. But basically she went from being in a wheelchair to, within a few years after following this diet, or less than 2 years, being able to walk around without a cane, being able to be active, and being able to manage her autoimmune condition. And I first got interested in this book because a friend of ours actually was diagnosed with MS, probably a year or two ago. And she told me about this book because she was reading it. And in my family, on my dad's side of the family, hypothyroid is very prevalent. My dad has hypothyroid. His sister, my aunt, had a tumor on her thyroid removed, and their cousin, so I guess my second cousin or whatever, I don't know how that all works, but my dad's cousin had thyroid cancer. And my dad told me that he was first diagnosed with hypothyroid when he was in his early 30s. I'm 30 right now. And even though he doesn't look like the typical hypothyroid patient, like when he was in his early 30s, he was still in the army, he was still doing physical training every day, he was thin, healthy, he did smoke back in the 80s or whatever, but he looked healthy on the outside. But his doctor told him that his hypothyroid was an autoimmune condition. And so I know that that is in my genetics. And I'm not saying that hypothyroid is as serious as MS, but it is an autoimmune condition like rheumatoid arthritis, irritable bowel syndrome, just all sorts of autoimmune diseases. So I was interested in this book, and now I'm not even halfway done reading through it, but it is really interesting. And basically for me, just for me, the takeaway has been to increase the amount of leafy greens and vegetables, because Dr. Walls has this 3-3-3 rule. This one of the basic rules for the diet is to increase the amount of leafy greens, and leafy greens, sulfur-rich vegetables, and brightly colored fruits and vegetables, especially berries, to 3 cups of each per day. And that is a lot. And I'm not saying I'm meeting that, I'm reaching that rule or whatever, but my partner and I have made a conscious effort to increase the greens and sulfur-rich vegetables and brightly colored fruits and vegetables in our diet, and I'm noticing a difference. I'm feeling better. I'm feeling healthier, just cleaner inside and out. So, and what's really interesting is she goes into, since she is a trained medical doctor, she goes into the research behind her claims and her own clinical studies, and also the molecular biology to explain why, for example, sulfur is such an important nutrient. And sulfur-rich vegetables include anything in the onion family, the cabbage family, so cabbage, broccoli, leeks, mushrooms, garlic, that kind of thing. And then brightly colored fruits and vegetables, especially berries, bell peppers, anything just brightly colored, means that there's more antioxidants there. And she actually goes into the explanation as to why antioxidants are important, and that's, you always hear in the news, like, studies show that antioxidants are important, but they never explain why. Like, what is the molecular biology? What is the chemistry behind this? And she goes into that, but she explains it in a way that someone with a degree in the humanities can understand it, or just your average everyday person can understand it, right? I'm not a science or math person at all, but it's been really interesting, and like I said, I'm not following the protocol to a T, and there's actually 3 different levels to the diet. There's like the basic, and then the more paleo, and then the more intense version of the diet that she promotes in this book. And of course, if you have multiple sclerosis or any serious autoimmune condition, it might be something to look into, and you might need to be very diligent with your diet. But as far as I know, I'm fairly healthy. I just know that I'm genetically predisposed to thyroid issues, and things here or there have popped up that kind of let me know that if I'm not careful, I think hypothyroid is kind of right around the corner for me. There have been a few symptoms that show me that it could happen, or it could be in the works already. So I just want to try to do the best that I can within my circumstances to kind of keep that under control. So it's been really interesting. So all of these different influences, the documentaries and reading this book and eating more vegetables, and I'll go into more detail here in a second about the decision my partner and I have made to only buy meat from the farmer's market. So I'll talk about that here in a second. But all of these have been like whirling around in my brain. And it's made me kind of sit back and reflect a lot on my relationship with food and how that has changed throughout the years. So when I was a kid, when we moved to Kentucky, I was about 5 years old. And so I consider myself from Kentucky, and I have family roots in Kentucky. My grandpa was from Appalachia in eastern Kentucky. So I basically grew up in Kentucky. And when I was a really small kid, between the ages of 5 and 10, we lived in a really small town, which, looking back, I would kind of consider it a food desert. And a food desert is basically when communities, usually poor, isolated rural communities or poor, isolated urban communities, when they don't live close to grocery stores, where it's hard to find, or it's hard to have access to fresh produce, for example, when most of the food that is around you is highly processed or fast food. And of course, it's always the poor and the working class that find themselves in these situations. So anyway, in the rural small town in Kentucky where we first lived, when I was 5 to 10 years old, there was only one grocery store, and it was a Save-A-Lot. And anybody from, I guess, the Southeast will probably know that Save-A-Lot is a poor grocery store. It's for poor people. And back in the 90s, that Save-A-Lot, when I went grocery shopping, or when I went with my mom grocery shopping, most of my memories are of aisles of just canned food and processed food. Off-brand, cheap, 20-cent can of green beans kind of thing. And so that's where we got most of our groceries. However, my parents, somehow, they kind of knew what to feed us and what not to feed us. For example, when we were kids, we rarely, if ever, had soda in the house. We weren't allowed to drink it unless we were at a church function or somebody else's house and it was served to us. They never bought those fruit juice, what's it called? Cocktails, where it's not really fruit juice and there's a bunch of added corn syrup and sugar to it. They never bought that. They still bought us fruit juice, but it was at least 100% juice from concentrate, but there was no added sugar. So they were really conscious of controlling our exposure to sugar. And even though a lot of the food we bought was processed, and I'm including canned food as processed food here, they at least focused a lot on vegetables or even canned fruit. But something that I'm so grateful for now, and I've always had a real strong attachment to this. My dad, thanks to the knowledge that his father passed down to him and his mother passed down to him, my dad knew how to garden, a vegetable garden. And so we've always, whether it was at my grandpa's house or at my parents' house, to this day, my dad has a vegetable garden. And so when I was a kid, we had a pretty sizable one. And that, at least during the growing season, gave us access to fresh, homegrown vegetables. We grew, of course, tomatoes, bell peppers, and different types of banana peppers, potatoes, greens, turnip greens, beets and beet greens, spinach, lettuce, what else? Green beans. Green beans are super easy to grow. So we always had green beans, corn, zucchini, yellow squash, watermelon, just all sorts of homegrown vegetables in the garden. And I would help my dad and do work in the garden. It was part of our chore list to go weed the garden or pick off the potato beetles from the potato plants. So that was always part of my background, I feel, that fresh vegetable garden. And my dad always told us when we were growing up, the more colorful your plate is, the healthier it is. And that reminded me of what Dr. Walls said in this book about increasing the brightly colored fruits and vegetables in your diet. I don't know how my parents knew how to eat healthy, they just did. And I think it might just be that knowledge was passed down from generation to generation, because my grandpa grew up on a farm in Appalachia and his mother knew how to make their own medicines. They were in an isolated part of Kentucky, so that woman, she gave birth to 14 children and she never saw a medical doctor a day in her life, ever. So that woman knew how to heal, she knew how to give birth, and she knew how to feed and cook on her own because of that knowledge being passed down. And it just seems that most people in this post-World War II, highly manufactured, highly processed food day and age, somehow that knowledge for a lot of people was lost. And it might have been lost because of urbanization and people moving to cities and leaving the countryside. I don't really know. I'm sure there's a whole mess of different social and economic and historical factors that went into that. But most of the people that I know don't know how to grow a tomato plant. And they don't know how to grow their own just basic, what I would consider basic vegetables like green beans and tomatoes and bell pepper, you know? Or they don't know how to cook. I remember when I went off to college, and I went to college at a private liberal arts institution. So there was a lot of middle upper class people there. But even among them, I remember our first year there, my freshman year, a bunch of friends and I, we decided to kind of have a homemade Thanksgiving dinner before going back home for Thanksgiving, for the holiday. And we decided to make turkey chili. And so I love to cook, so I volunteered to kind of lead the kitchen to make the turkey chili. And no one else but me knew what the hell they were doing. I remember I had a friend, and I handed her a red bell pepper and a knife. And I asked her, "Can you dice the bell pepper?" And she just stood there holding the two and looked at me like she was helpless, like she had no idea what dicing a bell pepper meant. And I had to explain it to her, like, okay, you cut it into pieces, you get rid of the core and the seeds, you make sure you wash it, and then you cut it into pieces about maybe this big. And so, but anyway, that kind of knowledge, like home care kind of knowledge and cooking, was another thing that I seemed to have, and that was passed down to me through the generations, that I'm also incredibly thankful for. My grandma on my dad's side, she was a bomb-ass cook. Like, it's a shame she died. She died 18 years ago now. So I wish my husband could have met her, but she could cook anything, and that's probably because, you know, she was born in 1931, I think, and she grew up in middle of nowhere, northern New Hampshire. So she learned all the New England dishes, and then she married my grandpa from Appalachia, so she came down further south and learned that kind of cooking. So she knew like the whole East Coast traditional dishes, from clam chowder to fried chicken, you know. And so Thanksgiving was always so delicious. We had like mashed squash and rutabaga, and the turkey was always delicious, and the homemade dressing, and mashed potatoes and green beans cooked with a chunk of salt pork in it. It was just, so like, she passed that knowledge down to my dad. My mom also knew how to cook, but not to the same extent as my dad's side of the family. So I learned a lot of cooking through my dad, and I'm just so thankful for that, because it's kind of tragic that that knowledge has kind of not been lost. I don't want to say it's been lost, but that generations of people have just grown up on manufactured processed food, and there's a lot of reasons behind that. Like I said, you know, poverty, food deserts. It's not because people don't want to cook. It's because people don't have the time or the resources to. But I think that is finally starting to change, because just the number of documentaries that have been made in the last 5 or 10 years about food, about diet, about health, about the importance of cooking and the importance of nutrition. Now, the dangers are a lot of these documentaries can sometimes present misinformation, but it seems like there is a resurgence of interest, at least within the United States, of returning to more traditional foods and meals and ways of cooking that pre-existed that post-World War II boom of manufactured and processed foods. And nowadays, even if you never met your great-grandmother or your grandmother or grandfather or father or whoever was the main cook in the family, even if you don't have access to that information anymore, you have the internet. And that also kind of gives me hope too. You can on YouTube, so many blogs and Pinterest, like there seems to be a renaissance of learning how to cook learning these kinds of essential skills so that you can have more control over the ingredients that are going into your food. And there seems to be a growing interest in buying produce and meat and eggs and things like that from farmers markets. However, I went to the farmers market recently, the local one here, and goddamn, that shit is expensive. You know, I'm not working right now, so we're just living off of my partner's income because he teaches at the university. He's not a professor, so he's not paid a professor's salary, even though he has a PhD. He's being paid as an instructor, and that's kind of lower on the totem pole, you know? And so money's kind of tight right now, and it seems like money's been tight my whole fucking life. But anyway, so I totally understand why a lot of people can't afford to buy their food at a farmer's market. I mean, we treated ourselves, we splurged and bought a pound of fresh tomatoes because fresh homegrown tomatoes just taste so much better than store-bought ones. But they were selling tomatoes for $4 a pound. Why would I do that if I can go to the grocery store and buy a can of tomatoes, for example, for 89 cents or whatever? The unfortunate thing is the can of tomatoes has a whole bunch of sodium and Lord knows what else in it, but I totally get why shopping regularly for all your produce and meat and stuff from a farmer's market just is out of reach for a lot of people. But that's why I wanted to include the grocery haul at the beginning of the video, because as you saw, all of the produce that we got at Aldi, sure, a lot of it was shipped across the world, and there's a whole environmental issue with that, and the use of fossil fuels to ship foods across continents and stuff. Like, I get that, but you want to eat healthy, you want to eat more produce, but produce is often some of the most expensive stuff in the store, or it's super expensive at a farmer's market and you can't afford to buy all your produce at a farmer's market, at least not in the part of the world that I live in. So what can you do? Find yourself an Aldi. And I know not everybody lives near an Aldi, but really, like, we live probably less than a mile away from an Aldi. They recently opened it here, and we are so thankful because Aldi has some of the most affordable produce of any grocery store I've ever seen. And Aldi in the last 5 years or so has really worked hard to reinvent itself and to provide more healthy options to lower income working class people. I've been getting my groceries at Aldi's for years because after we lived in that small town in the middle of nowhere, Kentucky, we moved to the neighboring county to a slightly larger town where there was an Aldi. But back in the 90s, I know Aldi was full of a lot of processed, a lot of processed food, not the healthiest food. But now they've made a commitment to get rid of all official coloring and preservatives from their food. You can buy organic, virgin, cold-pressed coconut oil, and organic almond milk, and organic milk, and grass-fed butter, and even organic fruits and vegetables at Aldi. You can buy quinoa and chia seeds. And what else do we get at Aldi? Gluten-free. They have really good gluten-free bread. So if you're avoiding gluten for whatever reason, but you don't want to spend like $8 to $10 for a loaf of gluten-free bread, for $4 you can get a loaf of gluten-free bread at Aldi. So it's just so great. And I worked at an Aldi. I'm just like loving Aldi so much right now, but I worked at an Aldi before I came to grad school as like a part-time job, and at that time, this was 2011 in Kentucky, in my hometown in Kentucky, they were paying $10 an hour, which for Kentucky at that time was like a great rate for a part-time job. I mean, my first part-time job was at a Kmart. I was a cashier at Kmart when I was in high school, and I was being paid $6 an hour. But that was back when the minimum wage was still $5.15 an hour. So, yeah, $10 an hour. And they also, a lot of their employees, they hire full-time, because this is another thing that, like, bullshit capitalism out of control has promoted in this country, is the huge chain stores like Walmart, for example. They will not hire their employees full-time, so that way they don't have to guarantee them health insurance or retirement benefits. Because if everybody's hired part-time, you don't have to give them benefits, and it's just... Anyway, it's bullshit. Aldi hires a lot of their employees full-time. They pay them $10 an hour, which is more than the federal level minimum wage, and they give them retirement benefits and health insurance benefits. And on top of that, they're providing affordable, organic, healthy food that the masses can afford. And so they're actually giving chains like Whole Foods and these more upscale chains a run for their money, because everybody's figuring out the secret and going to Aldi instead. So anyway, just try to find deals. Even if you don't live near an Aldi, just focus more attention on the produce section, because there's a lot of ways you can save money at the produce section. Instead of buying pre-chopped, pre-cleaned lettuce, buy a head of lettuce and chop it and clean it yourself, and it'll be cheaper, right? There are ways to save money, and as you saw at the grocery haul at the beginning of the video, we bought all of that produce plus organic milk and grass-fed cheese and all that. We bought all of that for $60. And that is enough for 2 adults to eat off of for an entire week. That is all the produce we need for an entire week. And now we eat a lot of produce, like I said, because we've been focusing on that. So we also cook the majority of our meals. On a weekly basis, usually only one of our meals comes from the outside, comes from like a restaurant or something like that. So all of our breakfasts, lunches, and dinners all comes from cooking ourselves, because I love to cook, but it's also healthier and more affordable. So now when it comes to meat though, we were buying factory farm meat for a while, but we've recently decided to make the effort to only get our meat from the farmer's market. Now, farmer's market meat is probably around 3 times as expensive as the factory farm meat. And I understand why farmers charge more. They're trying to compete with the factory farms. But with mass production, the only way to compete is to offer specialization. And so the farmer that we talked to that provided the beef, he is a beef farmer, a local grass-fed organic beef farmer. That is his thing. That is the specialty that he offers. And I think when it comes to the ethical treatment of animals, I'm willing to pay more, even if that means I have to cut back on the amount of meat that I'm eating, which is probably a good thing anyway. It's something I should have done anyway. And so that beef pot roast that I made, when we were actually sitting down and eating it, I noticed a hell of a difference. It almost tasted like we were eating venison, like if anyone has eaten venison, deer meat, which I have, deer and squirrel meat, because I grew up in Kentucky and my dad went deer and squirrel hunting. I got my redneck cred, right? I have had plenty of venison in my time, and this beef, because it was grass-fed and pasture-raised, it was so much more flavorful than the factory farm crap that you can get cheap at the grocery store. And it's healthier for you because the fats are healthier, because the cow is eating food it's meant to eat, not just grain and corn, which it never evolved to eat. And you know that the animal was allowed to just be a cow, to just walk around and eat grass and moo and fart and shit. And it just had one bad day in its life. All the other days were great. It had one bad day. That makes my spirit lighter and feel better, knowing that I'm no longer contributing to that factory farm torture shit. It really does. And sure, it might mean that we can only buy one main meat item per week, but through making stews and reusing the juices and making soups and boiling down the bones and things like that, you can really make it stretch into, at least for 2 grown adults, you can really try to make it stretch into a whole week's worth of meals. So it just makes me feel better, inside and out, knowing that that animal was respected and given a dignified life before its life was taken so that we could have nourishment from it, right? So just, I want to leave you with a few thoughts and a few questions. Just think about what you can do within your given circumstances, within your budget, within your life situation, within your community, to connect more with your food, right? Even if you live on the 32nd floor in an apartment, in the middle of a huge city, if you have a balcony, get like a 12-inch or 14-inch diameter pot, which you can find pretty cheap at certain stores like Aldi or Big Lots or something like that. Get some good dirt, get some tomato starter, and put on that balcony a tomato plant during the growing season and grow your own tomato. Because just interacting daily with that plant, checking the soil, fertilizing it, you know, you can buy, you can buy Epsom salt, like just regular Epsom salt that you would usually use for a foot soak or something. Epsom salt has sulfur and magnesium in it. Those are 2 essential nutrients for tomato plants and a lot of plants. Mix a teaspoon of that into 2 or 3 cups of water, dissolve it, and then water your tomato plant with that every 2 weeks or so, because that's a natural homemade fertilizer that you can do. Save your eggshells, grind up your eggshells and mix that into the soil when you plant your tomato plant, because tomatoes also need calcium. Just interacting daily with that one tomato plant, it can bring so much joy, especially when you start to see those tomatoes grow, and especially when you get to eat them. Right? Or like what we do here, we live in an apartment, so I can't till the ground in the backyard, right? It's not my property, it's not my building, but we have potted plants here. We have a tomato plant, we have oregano, mint, and thyme, and a basil plant. So grow your own herbs if you can, or if you own your home and you've always meant to start a vegetable garden but you don't even know where to start, find a really good organic gardener on YouTube with lots of videos talking about the process. One of my favorites is called the 1 Yard Revolution, and I'll include a link to his channel down below. It's a guy, I believe his name is Patrick, and he has a cute cat that usually makes an appearance named Oscar, a black and white cat that kind of roams around the garden following him around. But this guy talks about how he and his wife make their own compost, they raise their own worms, and they turn their fairly small backyard into just a huge food source. Like, their backyard isn't that big. My parents' backyard is probably 2 or 3 times as big as this guy's, but their entire backyard is just one huge vegetable garden. He goes into detail about what specific plants need, how you can make your own organic or homemade fertilizers for different plants and when to plant them, and you know, it's so great. So I'll include a link to his channel below. It's just, I watch it just to chill out and relax because I love how he talks, and you know, seeing the cat is always cute. I'm such a cat lady, but anyway. So yeah, if you've always meant to like turn that spot in the backyard into a small garden, maybe grow a few tomato plants and a couple of zucchinis or something, or turn it into an herb garden, but you don't know where to start, you know, go on Amazon, find a home gardening, organic gardening book for 10 bucks used or something, and order it, or find the YouTube channels that click with you and just get your hands into some dirt. And then once you start to harvest your fruits, the fruits of your labor, cook some bomb-ass meals with it. Like, cook something delicious with it. If you grow your own potatoes and you love mashed potatoes, harvest those potatoes and mash those fuckers and just enjoy it. Like, enjoy the minerals and the difference in taste that you're going to be able to taste between homegrown tomatoes or potatoes and the ones you can get at the grocery store. Or really, if you don't have the time or the space or the ability or the resources to grow your own tomatoes or something like that, just focus more on the produce section at the grocery store. Start incorporating more greens into your diet. Like, if you're making a vegetable soup, throw some frozen collard greens in there. Throw some spinach in there. Just explore. Try different recipes. Try recipes from different parts of the world. You know, get a cookbook. I'm looking at my cookbooks right here. I have a cookbook of recipes from Spain, one from Mexico, one from the Eastern Mediterranean, one from Italy. Different cookbooks that people have given me over the years because they know I like to cook. Just explore and just try to include more colorful fruits and vegetables, more greens, and more sulfur-rich vegetables into your diet, and I guarantee you'll notice a difference. You'll feel better. And just try cooking more of your own meals when you have time. If you only have time on Saturdays, and really Saturday dinner or Sunday dinner is the only time that you have off from the kids, from work, from whatever, to cook, take that time as sacred time and get your ass into the kitchen and cook something delicious. Something that you can take pride in, because kitchen witchery, cooking, is alchemy. You're taking something and turning it into a beautiful, delicious, homemade, nutritious meal that you can then share with friends and family. That right there is a magical act, and it's powerful, and I love it. So do what you can, and I hope you enjoyed this long-ass chat in the grocery haul and the little kind of recipe things that I shared at the beginning of the video. And comment below, like, share some of your favorite recipes. Share some of your gardening tips. Talk to me. Tell me how you try to incorporate gardening and cooking into your life. And even if you're super busy and you live in the middle of the city, share. Sharing is caring and knowledge is power. And until next time, happy cooking, happy eating, and many blessings. Bye.